On behalf of the Community Design Center of Rochester's Board of Directors and our Executive Director, Karen Nozick, I'd like to welcome all of you to the 18th Annual ReShaping Rochester Lecture Series. This is our second presentation in the 2023 season. My name is Bill Price, and I am President of the Board of Directors at the Community Design Center of Rochester. This year's lecture theme has been Now and Then. Although it's our 18th lecture series, it is our 20th year as an organization. So we thought with everything that has happened over, say, the last 4 or 5 years, maybe even a little bit longer, it would be an appropriate time this year, now that we're back live, meeting together and face-to-face, to see how some of the social and economic issues of the past few years have affected our communities and the planning and design of our neighborhoods. We've had a lot of lecturers over the years, and we chose the Now and Then series to ask some of our previous speakers to come back and give us a comparison of what they were speaking about, whether it was 10, 15 years ago, or even 3 years ago, and tell us what's worked and what still needs to be done. As I mentioned, the Community Design Center was founded 20 years ago in 2023, and we've been serving for 2 decades the Rochester area and the Finger Lakes region. Tonight's lecture is in memory of our beloved former executive director, Maria Ferguelli. Maria, as you know, passed away in June of 2022. Maria was a passionate leader of the Community Design Center. She was a licensed architect and lived almost her entire life here in Rochester. And she firmly believed that Rochester has all the ingredients to become a model American city and was committed to making that happen. So our lecture tonight is in Maria's honor. Quickly want to introduce the board of directors. It's myself, Monica McCullough is a board member and our past president, Stephanie Annunziata, Vanessa Villano, Howard Decker, Jean Dupre, Eugenio Marlin, Mike Pratico, Pamela Reese-Smith, Miriam Jacob, and Tanya Zwalin. Thank all of them for their unwavering support and dedication to the organization. I'd also like to acknowledge our executive director, Karen Nozick. Karen, where are you? Karen's been with us since October, and many of you are getting to know her as the face of our organization, and I will con her into doing this introduction sometime. Okay, we do have a circle of friends who are our major supporters, and these are all folks who have donated $500 or more to our organization, and just want to acknowledge their support and thank each of them. Tonight's gold sponsor is ESL. They've been a strong supporter over the years of the Community Design Center, and we greatly appreciate their continued support. We also want to acknowledge Council on the Arts, who have supported this lecture series over the last 18 years and are continuing to do so this year. Didn't mean to do that so quick. Anyway, special thanks go out this year to the Memorial Art Gallery for hosting this lecture series in partnership with the Design Center, to our exclusive media sponsor, WXXI, for their continued promotional support. Thanks to the Courtyard by Marriott on East Avenue for providing accommodations to our guest lecturers, to the AIA and the APA who are providing continuing ed credits for design and planning professionals. Many thanks to Hinge Neighbors for being our welcome committee tonight. Sean, are you here? And There you guys are, down in front. Would you just say hello? Thank you for doing it. Okay. The Hinge neighbors, in addition to being our welcoming committee tonight, also provided a breakfast this morning for Dr. Garrick, and we appreciate you bringing him up to speed on some of the important issues that are going on in town. I think I had one slide in here that I have to show for the credits. APA folks, please read. There you go. Okay. After the interloop, what next? I'd like to introduce Dr. Norman Garrick. Dr. Garrick is a professor emeritus in civil engineering and the co-director of Sustainable Cities Research Group at the University of Connecticut. In these roles, Dr. Garrick has led research on street networks and their impacts on the public, including bike and pedestrian safety, vehicle travel, and the health of residents, the role of parking standards in inducing traffic in cities, strategies to reduce traffic fatalities in the USA, societal impacts of autonomous vehicles, and the costs of transportation and their implications on equity. Dr. Garrick's research has been featured in New York Times, Washington Post, City Lab, Planetizen, which I still can't pronounce, Street Films, National Public Radio, and Australian Public Radio, among many other publications and websites. In addition to UConn, he has taught at MIT, Oxford University in the United Kingdom, the University of West Indies in Jamaica, and he has been a visiting professor at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. Dr. Garrick has received awards in 2007 and 2021 from the Transportation Research Board. He is a lead contributor in the Institute of Transportation Engineers and Congress for the New Urbanism's Street Design Manual. Many of you involved in transportation planning are familiar with that document. If you're not, please look it up. It's a great combination of public realm design along with land uses and how they can work well together. Great document, Doctor. He is a lead contributor. Oh, I already said that. In addition to that, he was selected by the National Endowment for the Arts to facilitate the Mayor's Institute on City Design. Dr. Garrick is a fellow of the Congress for the New Urbanism, where he has served on its national board for 8 years. Please welcome back to Rochester, Dr. Norman Garrick.
Thank you for that introduction, Bill. It's a real pleasure to be back here. I actually didn't think it would happen. It's actually beginning to feel like a long-term relationship. Actually, when I was thinking about my cover slide and thinking about what to use out of all the pictures I've taken over the years in Rochester, I did not realize that this was the founding project for the design center. I just found that out last night at dinner. So it's fortuitous that I decided to choose that picture. And I think it's such an important resource to have the design center for this city. Many places could do with having a design center all over the country. So I'm also honored, let me push the right button, honored that this is an event in honor of Maria, who I've gotten to know very well over the years. I met her in 2015 for the first time when this picture was taken. But I've seen her a few times back in Rochester, but all over the country at different conferences. And we really grew, myself and my husband, grew very fond of her. So I was shocked this year when I heard about her passing. So it's really an honor to be here in her memory. I also want to acknowledge Roger, who was the one that got me to Rochester in the first place. He was the first person that invited me to speak here. So thank you very much for starting that relationship. Okay, so the first time I was here, or maybe the second time, this was happening. And I thought this was the most incredible thing. They were taking mud from the lake and dumping it on a freeway. And I said, yes. This is what it deserved. So I went away and I wrote this article to bring it to the attention of people around the country, what was happening here, because a lot of places are talking about removing freeways, and not many have gotten very far. There's a lot of talk, and nothing. Here in Rochester, you have done something, and that's a really important step, first step in this road. So I wanted to talk about, after the interloop, interloop, that's what it is. I want to talk about what comes next, because I see this kind of being potentially a transformational time, because it really represents what came before for the last 70 years was this idea that all of us were going to own cars, all our grandparents, our kids, everybody was going to own cars, and we were going to get everywhere by cars, and this was going to give us freedom. And that was the belief for the last, at least since 1950, but probably going back earlier than that. And we think it's an American thing. We think this is what we want, but then when you stop and think where this idea came from, it came from GM. It is a well-marketed idea that is sold so constantly, it's almost like the air we breathe. So this happened with the interloop being removed, and I was hoping that when I came back, this is what I would see. And I am really, to me, this is like a miracle. I mean, you look at this, and I, as a designer, planner, whatever, I can criticize details. I can say this should be better, this should be that. But the thing is, it happened. And it's a miracle. And it's a potential to change how we think about transportation. So that's really what I want to talk about today, is what does that look like if we don't think that we have to get everywhere by car? How living like that, what does it look like? That's what I want to talk about today. So before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about Rochester, because I think we need to understand how we got to the point where we are now. One of the things that attracts me about Rochester is that it's a well-made city. And you can see it in many places, even with all that has happened and that has been done to Rochester. You can see the bones, you can see the richness of the built environment. And I think that's really important to recognize, because that's the starting point to changing some horrible things that has happened to American cities over the last several years. So the first time I came, I went back to Connecticut, and I started to look at these maps of Rochester from the century and a half ago. This was what Rochester looked like in 1889. I believe this plan was actually put in place probably as far back as the 1950s, 1850s, I'm not sure, exact date. But this is what the city looked like. 1917, this is what Rochester looked like. No change. 1951, some changes, but they're too subtle to see on this map. So for over 100 years, the city had a certain structure, a certain behavior, a certain form. Come the 1960s, that's what happened. And sometimes, you know, the first time I saw a picture like this of Hartford, Connecticut, where is the capital of my home state, I suddenly had this realization. You know, people talk bad about Hartford. They talk bad about Rochester, I'm sure. I looked at the picture of what was done to Hartford and I said, now I understand. It wasn't that Hartford is inherently troubled, it's that we destroyed much of the city. How do we expect a place to survive after we have cut out so much of its innards? It's not just the freeway. Look at downtown. Look at downtown okay. There you go back. Look at what was there before. Look at that fine-grained mixed-use buildings in the downtown. That was a different place. And look at what we have created. Parking lots and towers in the parking lot. That's what we created, and we expect these places to function. So that was in the 1960s. This is 2012. If you notice, it's frozen in time. So we cut out the inner loop, we cut out the center of the city, and nothing changed. And this is not just Rochester. This is Buffalo, this is Hartford, this is Rochester. You go on and on and on all over America, Oakland, California, all over the place. The exact same thing happened. The surprising thing is that Rochester was a little bit later than most places. I heard today that Rochester is a little bit slower, which in this case was a good thing. Okay, so those major things happened in the 60s in cities all over America, but actually the changes started before that. And for this, I have to give credit to Howard Decker. I didn't know that this work I was looking at was Howard Decker work because it's really tough to find out in this blog who actually produces it. But I've been using this material for a long time. And it's material that comes from a 1929 plan for Hartford. So Harlan Bartholomew is a really well-known name in traffic planning because he more or less invented the art of the engineering approach to transportation planning. And so he was like the Johnny Appleseed. He would go around and he would tell people that they had to destroy their cities so that they could widen the road, in essence. And this was the plan that he put forward for Rochester. And the idea was that he came in 1929, and for the previous 6 or so years, traffic was growing. So how they do it is they say traffic is growing, so it's going to continue growing at the same rate. So in 20 years' time, we're going to have this amount of traffic, so we need to build roads that are big enough to carry all of that traffic, not understanding that the very act of destroying your city is what is going to continue that curve to grow, or to grow even faster. The shocking thing is, as an engineer, is that this is what is still taught in engineering school all over the country, except for my students, of course, but that's a different story. It's still the same way that the DOTs operate all over the country. The Connecticut DOT, the New York State DOT, they're still with this idea. They've never heard of the idea of induced traffic. But this was something that was applied to the situation in Rochester in 1929. And this is a diagram showing planting the seed for the inner loop. You can see it right there. 1929. So the fact that the inner loop wasn't built until the 1970s, the seed was planted by Mr. Bartholomew in 1929. So this happened all over the country. So what happened with traffic? And you can see here, you can see all kinds of socio-economic changes, historical changes happening. You can see the Depression, right? You can see the war. You can see the two oil crises. You can also see something happening in the 2000s, early 2000s. Nobody knows what happened then. I've tried to study it and I can't figure out what happened. So anyway, let's look at this period. This is when the major changes were happening in cities. And you can see that the building of the freeway system, 1956, Mr. Eisenhower signed the Interstate Highway Bill. You can see how it bends the curve. So this was not inevitable. This was created by the decisions we made as a country. We are the only country which on a per capita basis is above the 2,000 trillion. Well, I'm talking about major country. I'm not including the United Arab Emirates. But we are the only country. Germany is below the 2,000 trillion miles. Germany is a car-producing country. Japan is at the 1 trillion miles mark on a per capita basis. So we, as a country, we are extraordinary. We're extraordinary. And it's about the decisions we made in the 1950s and 60s to decide that everyone was going to own a car. I just wanted to highlight the area in blue. You recognize what's going on there? Yes. So, yeah, the amount of driving fell, but not that much. When we were all locked up at home, it wasn't, it didn't, I would think it would have fallen more. But what's interesting is that it's not come back to the level it was prior to the corona. So the reason I want to highlight it is because it seems to me that this is a really important decision point. Because things are not going back to what we consider as normal. Most people, everybody's not going back to driving 30 miles to get to work. So things are going to change, and we need to consider that point. Just to go back a bit, we would sometimes think that nobody knew what was going to happen. Jane Jacobs knew. She warned us in 1960s. Louis Mumford knew. And Jane Jacobs in 2004, when she was in her 90s, she wrote that traffic engineering is the anti-science masquerading as the science it has betrayed. And it's that science of the idea that traffic is just going to keep growing. We need to build bigger and bigger and bigger roads. That's what she was talking about. Things don't work like that. There's no reality to any of it. Okay. Some of the other things that were happening aside from widening the roads, you had streetcars. Some of you might remember. In Hartford, the streetcars were dismantled systematically starting in 1924. By 1941, it was all gone. A systematic dismantling. I think the same thing happened here. I don't know the exact date. So this shows what has happened over the years. Population has almost doubled since 1925. Car ownership went up 8 times. 8 times. Some other things happened. Bus, we think about bus, but bus really just had a very short period of flourish before the Montgomery bus boycott, which I think I'm mentioning, but I think it had a really impact on who used bus in America. Buses, subways, almost nothing has happened since 1950. Well, it's decreased. We have had Atlanta, San Francisco, Washington, D.C. are places that have built subways since. And light rail. Since the 1981, when Portland and San Diego built new modern light rails, we have had light rails built all over the country, including Buffalo. A lot of them have been done very, very badly, and so they don't work. But it's something that we need to reconsider. So this is really a history of what has been going on over the last several years. So what happened with our cities? That was the transportation. What happened with our cities? This was done by a few of my grad students a few years ago. We reconstructed Bridgeport, Connecticut. Looks like a very functioning city, right? It has a main street where all the blue is, mixed-use Main Street. It had residents around the main street downtown. It had a railroad line. This is Bridgeport in 1913. This is Bridgeport in 1954. You're starting to see parking lots popping up, but it's more or less the same place. So again, a similar pattern to what happened here. This is Bridgeport today. Bridgeport is one of the Connecticut cities that cannot pay its bill. It almost went bankrupt 10 years ago. This is what we did to Bridgeport. 2 freeways, parking. The orange buildings are government-owned. They don't pay taxes. So what is left? Oh, we have a bank tower, People's Bank. An out-of-state bank just bought it. So it's not in that city anymore. This is what we did to the cities by changing from one mode of operation to the other. And what happened to the people? Well, of course, you know, the people went, oh, what did I do now? Oh, okay. Okay, all right. Okay, so you probably have heard the term 15-minute city. And have you heard about the controversy about the idea that it's some scheme to keep people within a 15-minute area of the city? I won't go into there. I think the 15-minute city idea is incredible. Bridgeport was a 15-minute city. Today, Bridgeport is what I would call a 60-minute city. You have to drive everywhere to get everything. And what happened there was that the commerce was 2/3 less, is 2/3 less. The industry almost totally disappeared. Residents almost totally disappeared. Where did these people go? Well, they went here. That's more like Arizona, actually. This is the example. Chuck Banyas produced these maps in Buffalo showing the yellow was the area that suburban Buffalo took up in the 1950s. The red is the area that suburban Buffalo takes up now. Just think about how crazy that is. What would you expect with the population here? You would expect that the population tripled, right? This is what the numbers look like. 1 million people, 1950 in the metropolitan area, 1.2 million people living on 120 square miles in 1950, now 3 times the area. Think about the inefficiency. Think about the waste. Think about the environmental impact. Think about all of those things. This is absolute insanity. So, after the last time I was here in 2016, James and I were invited to give a talk in Zurich. And this was after my first time being there as a visiting professor. We returned, and 2 days after we were there, we were like, we're moving here. So I've been moving, as you can see, furnishing up my apartment, and there, and there. And people ask, why Zurich? It's expensive. It's far. Why Zurich? And one of the things I tell them, it's not the weather. Because this is what Zurich looks like in November, December, January. There are mountains behind the fog. And the Chamber of Commerce type, they like to show the mountains. Most of the time, you can't see the mountains. So obviously, it's not about the weather. What it is about is this, is the fact that I can come out of my gate, my yard, my house, my apartment, and I can turn right and go up a very steep hill, and in 5 minutes, I'm here. Or I can walk across town and get on a train and get here. This is in the city. Or I can walk down the hill. This is the town center, which we thought was such a beautiful town center. It turned out it's not all that. But 2 minutes that direction, there's a town center which doesn't look so grand, but it has 3 supermarkets, a pharmacy, it has a bookstore, it has a natural food store, it just goes on, flower shop, everything is there. And 2 minutes up the hill, there's a butcher shop, and there's a bakery. So it's, the access to things that you like and need and want. It's so evident and so ready. We have so many variations of neighborhood. This is an older neighborhood across town from us. It's a 20-minute tram ride. And this, most people don't recognize as this inland city, is one of the best bathing cities in the whole world. Bathing on the lake, on the rivers. It's just incredible, the ability to get to places. This is our old downtown. This is the medieval main street, the Renweg. And this is a downtown that is 5-minute walk away from the old downtown, next to the railroad station that was built in 2010 on railroad land. The ability to get to things is like, sometimes your head spin is like, where do you go? Because I haven't been to Europe in a while, because it's just like so many other competing things. So that's the why. And those are all the arrivals in 30 minutes time. At the Zurich train station, it has 3,000 trains. 3,000 trains per day. 3,000 trains per day. And so, 2 weeks ago, we decided we needed a break from Zurich. And we had read about this valley that is off the grid because it has no electricity. So it closes in the winter. We got on a train at 10 o'clock in the morning. By 2 o'clock, we were in the valley. Train, post bus, in the head of the valley, walking into the valley. We walked in the valley, and by 6 o'clock, we were home. No cars. And one Saturday, we come upon this. So we were just strolling. We didn't know where we were going. We come upon Ballet for All on the Sechser-Lorton Platz. This is like the biggest Platz that used to be a parking lot, by the way. 12,000 people enjoying concert. Now think about any event you have been to with 12,000 people, and think about what happens before and after. This is what happened in Zurich after. 5 minutes after. Bye-bye.
Go fast.
It's like no fuss. Not ready to get to that yet. The efficiency is incredible. Next to the Sechser-Lorton Platz, there is a main train station with maybe 10 train tracks, 10 different train lines. There are at least 5 tram stops. There are buses, so people are dispersed in all directions. The city doesn't put on extra trams or extra buses. People it's almost as if they disappear into the normal running of the system. Talk about efficiency. And then here we are told that this is freedom. This is what freedom looks like, except in the car ads, it's only one car driving in the city, right? So, the reason I'm talking about this is that there's a different way to run cities. Cities do not need to be built around cars. And there is a potential to start thinking about that here. It's not that it's gonna happen. It didn't happen in Zurich overnight. It's not going to happen here, but we need to start thinking about the possibility of living a different way that doesn't involve always getting into. I was reading recently that the SUVs that people are buying, the battery alone weighs more than 1,000 pounds. So that's where Zurich is now. I want to talk about the past because you will see that there are some similarities to what you saw here in America. This is what the downtown currently looks like. There was a plan to do this to the downtown. This is exactly urban renewal, level everything, and build what I call here Frankfurt on the Limmat. Because this is what they did in Frankfurt, Germany, except that in Frankfurt they probably had help from the Americans and the French, well, the Americans and the English. Yeah, in America we just leveled place, and a lot of places we leveled them and nothing was built on it. This was a plan for Zurich in 1933 by Karl Moser. The irony is that I used to live in a building that was designed by this gentleman before he went crazy. Streets. This is what streets look like at the turn of the century in Zurich. This street is not that much different from what it was then, except that there are car tracks, the car lanes on it. Now they're thinking of removing all the cars from this street. Peter Norton, a very good friend from University of Virginia, he has written about the history of how we got here. And one of the things he writes about is that we tend to think that Americans wanted this. And he talks about the battles that was fought by people trying to push back against what he calls motordom. So when you read the stories, you realize that it's not true that this was American will. It was something that was imposed on us. In Zurich, we were told you can't use the street like on the right, it's false. We had to behave like on the right rather than on the left. And you think about Germans, and that's how our Germanic people, you think that's how they're going to behave anyway. But that's not true. This is how people thought that the street should be used. It says that this is a definition of the road. Forcing pedestrians to behave, get out of the way of the cars. This was 1927 in Zurich. This is what Zurich looked like in the 1950s. The trams were stuck behind cars. This is right before the main train station. So Zurich had a period of following the trend and trying to become car-oriented. This is the growth in cars after the war. There were almost no cars in the city, 20 per 1,000. After the war, it just skyrocketed, and the government was all in. The government wanted this. And I put 2 marks there. We have been concerned about the growth in China. Zurich had 10 years of Chinese growth in almost 2 years. So when you think about European cities and think about, oh, they're so different, remember their history. Zurich, a lot of places here we build freeways dividing cities from the waterfront. In Zurich, the freeway was in the water. Actually, it's still in the water. It's still there. I took this picture. So they wanted to be, they had gone to Italy, they had gone to France, to Germany, and they had gone to Italy, and they had gone to America. They wanted to be like those places. So what they proposed were, would turn the forecourt of the train station into a car parking. You notice all the trams are gone. And they had the idea that they would build highways into the city in a Y right into Zurich, and that's what really led to the revolt. One of the big things in Zurich that we don't have here in Switzerland is that before you can build anything, there's a referendum. So this had to come to referendum. And in 1962, the voters rejected a highway plan and also a plan to take the trams and put them underground and call them subway. The government was persistent. They came back in 1973 with the same plan. And I'm intrigued by what the reasons that were given for rejecting the subway. They said we didn't want to be Manhattanized. We didn't want to become big. We wanted to stay what we were. We didn't want to become big. They also said that subways are good if you're coming from far. If you're in the city, down, up, it's not good for you. And then the third thing they said is, oh, yeah, you want to take the trams off the road so you can get more space for cars. So very forward-thinking public advocates for this city. So in 1973, the advocates, like a lot of you here, decided that we couldn't trust the professionals, we couldn't trust the government, we had to come up with our own plan, and this is the plan they came up with. The plan was based on 6 principles: give priority in law and policy to buses and trams. So the buses and trams are considered the highest level of travel. Create exclusive travel lanes and traffic prioritization. So the tram and buses never stop. They have their own lanes. Increase frequency, really important key. Expand the transit system. They have been doing this continuously for 40 years. Improve the interchanges. So yes, you're going to change line, but make it a comfortable experience, an efficient experience, and improve the stop areas. Those were the simple ideas that these advocates came up with, and the government was resistant, but then people realized that the government plan cost this, and what they were asking for cost this. And that's something we also never talk about, because transit is expensive, right? But what about building all those highways in upstate New York? So this is what happened in Zurich. So I showed you that run-up. This is what has happened since the People's Plan was implemented. The growth in cars have stopped. Most homes in the city do not own cars. The last time I checked, there was 187,000 cars in the city of Zurich. It's the same number that they've had for the last 20 years. And this is in a city that keeps growing by 2,000 to 5,000 people every year. Before the plan was implemented, the city's population, just like here, was plummeting. After the plan was implemented, the city's population started to increase. So all of those changes happened on the back of changing how you think about transportation. Okay, so one of the things I get when I try to talk about some of these things is pushback. The Swiss are so weird. And I agree they're weird. So let me just show you how weird they are. It's a spring festival in Zurich, special to Zurich. It's called the Sechsalorten. And what it's about is they load the snowman, they fill his head with explosion. They put him on a pile of wood, and then they burn the pile, and then they watch the clock to see how long it's going to take for his head to explode. And if it explodes in 5 minutes, it means that spring is almost over. And to me, this seems really medieval. And people are standing there, and there is cinder singeing your hair, and you're breathing all of this. This is in the center of the city. They're strange. But the point I want to make is that regardless of how strange they are, there are things we can learn from them. One of the things we can learn from them is that a car-light city is possible. The second thing we can learn from them is some of the details as to how that works. And so this is, how do you live a car-light city? And actually, I just posted this on LinkedIn the other day. And for years, I didn't recognize the importance of this space in the bus or the tram. It's where babies and moms go. It's where people with bicycles, it's where people with furniture. It's where people in wheelchair goes. And every single bus and tram in the city have multiple ones of these spaces. Sometimes there's a traffic jam of baby carriages. But it's a system that is made for all people. It's not just for getting to work. And that's part of how this works, is the idea that you're giving people ability to get around without cars. So you see lots of daddies pushing their babies around. You see lots of moms, you see lots of couples sometimes. One of the things that we just started researching at UConn with my PhD student there is this issue of the sheer cost of this car-oriented culture that we have created. This is some of the data that she found. In 1920, when downtown Rochester looked like that, the spending on transportation was less than 5% of household income. Now, the spending on transportation is the second largest expenditure after housing. It's a really, really expensive system. These are also some numbers from my student research. If families in poverty in America spend almost $7,000 on, if you have a car, almost $7,000 on transportation. Think about the car that people in poverty have. Think about the cars that people in poverty have. People in poverty that do not have cars spend less than $2,000. This to me is important because in America, the discussion about improving transportation is always about free transit. How does free transit help when transit is so horrible that you're still forced to have a car? Free transit is not the issue. It's about giving transit that people can use to get where they need to go. So we have invented in our research group the idea of captive drivers. There are lots and lots of people that have to have cars in the United States. They can't afford it, and they're forced into having cars. Lots of young people that shouldn't be in cars. That's the system we have created. Our own experience in Zurich we spent $3,000 for the three of us for transportation. in this expensive city. This was one of the reasons we could afford to move there. $3,000 per year. In Connecticut, we spend $16,000 because we have to have 2 cars in Connecticut. It's not talked about enough, this idea of how expensive a car culture is. In Zurich, they collect 60% fare return. In American bus systems, that's usually more like 20%. So even though they have this extensive system, it's not getting that much government money to keep it going. And part of the reason is in this picture here, you see the number 15 tram? That's a 1978 tram. So it's a 40-year-old vehicle. The other one, the number 4, is a 2022 tram. So you have this system that is very efficient in using things. So transit, there is obviously, I love the art in the city. I love the care in the public realm that you see here. So obviously, somebody has put some thought into transit in Rochester. And this building, I think, is a really nice building. It's a really nicely designed building. But when I saw it for the first time, I must say that it set off alarm bells. And the alarm bells are that this is a system that is focused on getting people downtown. It's not focused on getting people around the city. And that's a huge deal. A transit is not about just people coming into downtown. This is an idea of why transit is so good in Zurich. The red line is the city of Zurich. Red and orange means that, let me get the numbers, it means that you're living within a quarter mile of a stop with a frequency of 10 minutes or less. So 95% of the population live in that kind of zone. We live close to a little mountain railroad. That's our closest transit. And after 6 o'clock, it has a frequency of 15 minutes, and we get really mad. Because we have to climb this really steep hill. But that was our choice. So this is how it works. Most visitors to Zurich see the trams, the fancy trams. Actually, this is a 40-year-old tram. You see the lines of the tram. It's kind of radial, but it still circles the downtown. But then, this is what the bus lines look like. Not at all radial, it's more like a grid. And then, this is what the suburban trains look like. They mostly do not have stops in the city. There may be 5 or 6 stops in the city. But when you overlay all of them, this is what it looks like. So often when we get out of the house and we go to Romerhof Platz to get the number 3 or the number 8, number 3 goes in one direction, number 8 goes in the other direction. But somehow they meet up at the same place. So you can take either one, and you can get almost anywhere in the city. So you miss the number 8, 7 minutes later it's coming, but why wait for that? You can take the number 3, which is coming in 3 minutes. It's just a totally different way of looking at transportation. And I just wanted to share this with you because I was doing a project a few years ago with an MS student, and he found this saying, organization before electronics, before concrete. In the US, it's all about the building, it's all about the concrete. What this is saying is that think about how things are organized. Think about what you can do with what you have before you start thinking about building new things. Organization, electronics is just amazing. The fact that I can find out so much information, I can buy everything electronically before concrete. So, let me take a slight detour. So we live on the edge of that map in Storrs, Connecticut. To get here, It's impossible. There is no good way. I mean, you can get in a car, it's 5 or 6 hours. We can drive to Boston and fly here. Drive 2 hours to Boston, fly here. Or like I did one year, James took me to Rhinebeck and I got on a train. This region is kind of stuck in some kind of nightmare from the 1950s. There is no connections between these cities except driving. So yesterday when we were driving up, well, yeah, I mean, I want to talk about this a little bit. This is the region that this innovation came from 200 years ago. This opened up the whole country, and it created New York City. This was a revolutionary, regardless of what you want to think about what we have done to the land. Let's forget that. It opened up, it created so much prosperity. And yet, this is a region that is stuck in not knowing how to connect to each other, to Toronto. It's just, to me, it's insanity. This is what we saw yesterday coming up. This is the 1 train per day, right? All right, so the second thing, the first thing was about the transit. The second thing is how do we get people to get around by bike? That was one of 2 bikes I saw today. By bike, and she just got off the road and went on the sidewalk, and which is what I would do also. How do you get people to get around by bike? How do you get them to get around on foot? This is a newly built road, by the way. It's about safety. It's about comfort. It's about livability. It's about shade, all of those things. And the amazing thing is that this is in our backyard here. We have some of the most beautiful streets in America, which shows how it can be done. And we also have the example of this converting a mini highway into a walkable street. But this is a main street in Zurich. This is a main street. The traffic just have to stop behind the tram. The traffic fatality rate in Rochester is 6 times higher than in Zurich. And that tells me that there are lots of streets that need work here, in all of those ways that I'm talking about. And I saw some, but I won't pick on them. And then the last thing I want to talk about is parking. Because I think parking is both an enabler of what we've been talking about, but it's also kind of a symptom of the problem. So you look at all those nice apartments, and hanging onto all of them are these massive garages. Okay. When you're trying to operate 2 different systems, you're trying to operate the 1950s system, and you're trying to operate a different type of system. It's really tough. You're always going to be compromised. So the idea is, can we move towards a different, the system, a different system? I've done a lot of work about parking. This is Hartford in 1957, Redis parking. This is Hartford today. This has been very influential work. We have now no minimum parking in Hartford anymore, partly due to this work. We have also mapped cities around the country, showing what happens. The more parking you have, the less people. More parking you have, it's not really rocket science, right? But people will deny it. We had to write this very complicated paper to prove that more parking leads to less people, that more parking kills city. And we copied it from what they did in the 1950s to prove that smoking caused cancer. Rochester, by the way, is somewhere down here. Just guessing. Yes. That's Lowell at the far end, and that's Cambridge, Mass. At the top, and that's Berkeley, the second one down, and Zurich is not on the map. Parking kills city. But that's not what I wanted to talk about, because I could spend the whole time talking about that. What I wanted to talk about is once you start developing a different type of city, the city starts to change. So this is in Zurich. I have been taking these pictures all over the city. People are trying to get rid of their parking garage lots or garage space, parking plots for rent. This is all over the city. Or you see this, where they turned the parking garage into a parking for something else, or it's turned into an apartment, or it's turned into a garden space, and you see it all over the city. So that's the evolution of a city that used to be different into something else. This place, I believe there were 300 apartments built here, 300 apartments above, a movie theater, a natural food store, a bookstore, a restaurant. It was built with 4 parking spaces. So this is how the city has evolved, because you're not about cars anymore. Actually, the story about this, there are 2 interesting things about the story. First, it was government land that was used as a surface lot for trams. The trams are still there, so if you go into the movie theater, you can see the trams sleeping. Or in the restaurant, there are glass plates so that you can watch. People like me, I suppose, they're aiming for. The second thing is these are all affordable housing. Zurich is very expensive, but almost, I think over 50% of the housing in the city is either government housing or something called a Genossenschaft, which is a co-op. So you have these big co-ops build places like this, very high quality architecture, and it's not a non-profit co-ops, they keep the rates half market rates. So that's how they deal with market rate housing in Zurich. So, Rochester. So I was walking around today. One of the things I love in Switzerland is bakeries, and in Connecticut you can't find bakeries. I found a bakery on East Ave. And I just really want to end this presentation by this building, because I think it's symbolic. It's symbolic of reoccupying car places. And I think this is the kind of message I really want to take away from this presentation, is that we really need to find ways to reoccupy all the car spaces in the city of Rochester. So thank you very much for your attention.
Why don't we take about 5, maybe max 10 minutes for some questions? I know there'll be a lot of them, and then I'll have a few words for everybody about our next lecture. Karen has the mic.
I know this crowd has some good questions.
Thank you, Karen. I'm Mary Myers, and because I taught high school, I always stand up and see all my people. It's left over from cafeteria duty days. And it's a fabulous presentation. Thank you so much. And in the vein of exploding snowman heads, and today's the day after International Women's Day, the first cantons in Switzerland let women vote in 1971. In the 60s, in a referendum, over 60% voted against letting women vote, and the last cantons let women vote in the 1990s. So not a question, but an additional tidbit to wrap around this country of Switzerland that's 1/3 the size of Pennsylvania and has between 25 and 30 independent cantons. Thank you.
So you talk about Zurich's reorientation, right?
Yes.
And how it wanted to be like Manhattan. So what happened?
It did not want to be like Manhattan.
Right, but there was a plan to
Yes.
Manhattanize, and it was rejected, right?
Yes.
So in the U.S., we have a racist history that caused white flight and manufacturing to be moved out of the cities.
Yes.
So how does that inform the question of what the cities can become when the capital has left the cities, the law firms have left the cities, and what we're left with is all of those visionaries and those with resources moving to Victor and Canandaigua?
Yeah. Well, I totally agree with you. This is something that I have not explored in research, but I strongly believe that the American exceptionalism that led to so much driving and so much wide flight and so much sprawl is tied to our history of racism. So that I cannot dispute. I strongly believe that that is the case. Rochester, like a lot of cities, have a lot of resources. And I don't think we can keep moaning about what left. I think we really need to look at what is still here. You're bustling with universities. That's a starting place. And there are lots of, the Strong, I was shocked today when I walked through the Strong. There is so much resource here. We cannot always be talking about what left. We have to work with what is here, I believe. And I think there's enough here to change. And even in that context, how can we keep operating a system that is bankrupting us and that is bankrupting our citizens? There is just no justification for it, especially given that we have lost so much resources. The monies to buy cars, does any of that stay here? The monies to buy gas, does any of that stay here? Transit monies pay people that are likely to be living here. So it's really, the idea is not about what we have lost. It's really about trying to recover. And the strange thing in America is that places that have become less car-oriented are now some of the most wealthy places. And these was not, and I'm talking about places like DC, like Cambridge, like Portland, like San Francisco, like Seattle. All of those places, Portland was in a much worse condition than most West Coast cities, East Coast cities, before it started changing. So there are lots of things to build on here, I personally believe.
Quick comment, I guess. Hi, good to see you, Doug. I'm Doug Funky from Buffalo. I was here in Rochester when we toured the project of filling in your trench there, and it was wonderful. We're right now in Buffalo having a fight about the same thing. The Scajaquada and the Kensington, we just won the Scajaquada. It's not going to be a Parkway Expressway through a park anymore. But the Kensington, we're trying to get it filled, but the DOT wants to spend, the filling would cost $50 million. I'd love to, if anybody here knows how much it cost to fill the inner loop, I'd like to know that. It'd help us make our fight in Buffalo. But the DOT wants to spend $1 billion to put a cap over it so that we can still have the highway with all the cars going through it. And we're saying, why don't we spend the $50 million that the feds are giving us and fill it in and have our park back. So we're still in the fight, and love the examples you gave. If anybody can tell us how much it cost Rochester to fill the inner loop, it would help us fighting the fight in Buffalo.
Total. It was about $30 million total for the city of Rochester. That was a lot of combination of federal, state, and local money.
A lot less than a billion.
Yes. I got a question for you, Dr. Garrick. The tax difference between Rochester and Zurich. Do you get an idea of the difference in taxes? Because one of the things that holds back our Rochester community is obviously taxes and the cost. I mean, where do we get money for this? So can you explain a little bit about how much it costs to live in Zurich?
Well, you asked about the tax. Let me try to answer that. There is a wealth tax in Zurich, which is something we don't have here, which you're right, it makes a huge difference. They're taxing wealth, and they have lots of rich people. I think here there are things that the city can do on its own, but there are also things that you're going to need the state government to buy in. So I'm not saying any of this is easy or it's cheaper than what we have been doing, but it's to convince the state government to buy into some of these ideas is what is difficult here, because that's where a lot of the money will have to come from.
Good evening. Mercedes Vasquez-Simmons. I have a question. The city has a plan, I believe it's called the 2034 plan, which should improve walkability and sort of capitalize on our waterways. Have you had an opportunity to look at that plan?
I have not looked at it, no.
Okay.
Yes.
I'd like to send you that plan and would love your feedback
Yes.
on it.
Yes.
Thank you.
What's going on, brother? You just brought something to enlightenment to me when you talked about the bus boycotts, and it painted something different in my head. And you might have studied this or might not, but it made me realize that because public transportation is valuable. Mm-hmm. But then there became an attachment for the people who use public transportation, which then forced people to say, you better get a car because you don't want to be sitting next to these.
Exactly.
How do we work in unison or with municipalities, people, persons to actually say, all right, I can sit in major cities. Yes, public transportation works. In mid to small size cities, it's like I'm not riding the bus because that's associated with these particular colored people, these particular economic status people. If I'm sitting next to them, then people are going to perceive me a certain way. So people don't. I could be wrong, but most people, I guarantee you, most people I can point at 4 people right here that I know did not drive a car here, but most people drove a car here because you're like, I'm just going to keep driving because I'm not looking at them and I'm not riding this public thing. Because it is associated with things. I can only speak about that in Rochester. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm incorrect. How did that happen in Zurich, or how have you seen that happen in major cities where the turn has been, all right, we all accept public transportation, and it's not just for black and brown people, and we don't got to be afraid to ride it?
I think you're right, but I think you also overestimate the fact that the bus system is crap. The fact that you have to wait an hour or a half an hour to get the bus, that's not a service. That's really saying that people are desperate. The reason why we came up with the term captive drivers was that in my field, in academia, they're always talking about captive riders. And the reason they say that is that we don't care what kind of service we give them because they have no choice. And in the reality, that's not what is happening in the country. There are people that choose, almost everybody that chooses to ride the bus, by the way, a quarter of the people in America that choose to ride transit lives in New York City because they have service. So part of it is about service. The attitudes about people is also part of it. But I've seen it change. I mean, I see, when I started going to Washington, I went to Washington every year for 30 years for a conference. And when I started going there in 1982, nobody but black people rode the buses. That's changed there because they have good service. Yeah, so it can change, but there is that cultural attitude that is involved.
Thanks for a talk that was a lot of fun and very informational too. Like many of us, you celebrated the Inner Loop East project and filling it in and building it back. As maybe you know, there's an Inner Loop North project in the works. Could you talk some about the potential and pitfalls of that?
Well, I think one of the pitfalls is for anybody that walk out and see the south, what is it, the east side, the east, is the fact that there is this sense that you have to replace the capacity, the traffic capacity. So you have that massive highway. I was there at 4 o'clock today, and there were almost nobody using that facility. So this idea is very fixed in the head of people that leave a lot of colleges and end up at DOTs. And that's what you're going to have to push back constantly there, that you have to replace the capacity. I spoke about Sean's group invited me to speak on a webinar a few years ago. And the thing that struck me the most was this idea that there was no need to replace the Interloop North. There was absolutely no need. There was enough capacity in the grid. And there are lots, the interesting thing and the weird thing is that streets need some traffic. And if you're forcing everybody on the freeway, they're not going on the surface roads. So a lot of cities have these very abandoned side streets, which could carry some of the traffic. So that's one thing that I think is really important that we need to push back against, is the idea of replacing that piece of facility.
Does anyone have a last question for Dr. Garrick? Suzanne.
Thank you for coming. One of the questions I have is that now that we're going into the process of, we've done a feasibility study for the Interloop North, we go into the nuts and bolts of engineers deciding how this should be done. And we'll start on that process soon, and then we'll have land, and we're hoping to have land use at the same time as that. One of the things I'm worried about is that now the Department of Transportation comes in, plays a big role that can ruin all sorts of thoughts about what people really wanted. And now we have to say, well, and fire departments have done in the past as well, it's not wide enough or something like that. What would you suggest? We know we have to advocate going forward. How do we do that? Or maybe we should be saying, just put in public transportation, forget the roads. But can you help us there?
Well, I think what you have started to do is to have, like the People's Advocates in Zurich, is to have an alternative as a starting place. So you're not reacting to what they're giving you. Is that you're saying, this is what we are seeing for our area. And that at least puts you in in a position of arguing from some position of authority, rather than just saying that we don't like what you're doing. Yeah. But aside from that, it's a tough fight because this is a very entrenched system. It's a system that is very powerful. And a lot of us, it's really hard to not buy into the system if you live in this country. I'm a UConn basketball fan, and I turn on the basketball game, and there are 10 car ads. I mean, how do you fight that? You just have to, it's just something that we have to be aware of, that, they're going to come and say, what is the traffic going to do? And it's going to sound like a reasonable question. It's not a reasonable question, but it's a question you're going to get. Okay. It's about what is the city that you want is the question. And it looks to me like that's the question that people are asking here. But trying to get that through to the DOT, good luck.